Thank you, everybody. E te atua te whai. We gather this evening with gratitude for the opportunity to learn together and to reflect on how we can contribute to a more just, compassionate and sustainable world. We give thanks for the wisdom found in the gospel and in the tradition of Catholic social teaching, guiding us to honour the dignity of every person, stand alongside those who are vulnerable and care for our shared home and communities. As we begin, help us to listen deeply and learn from one another. Open our hearts to new insight and strengthen our commitment to lead with integrity, humility and courage. Inspired by the Mercy tradition, may we continue to respond to need with practical aroha, compassion and hope. Bless Father Gerard Aynsley for generously sharing his knowledge with us tonight, all who serve in leadership and governance across our Mercy Ministries and for all we serve. Amen. Welcome, Gerard Aynsley. I'm looking forward to it.
Oh, thank you. Nice to be actually online and after that little sort of thing, hopefully underway. So nice to join you. A few familiar faces, although I can't see you all now. But this is a great topic and, I'm really happy to, present it. And I think one of the things I enjoy about Catholic social teaching is there's no way that you can just pull out what I've last talked about. It always invites us to go back, revisit it, think about it in new ways. And so good to join you all. It used to be said that, Catholic social teaching was the church's best kept secret. I don't think that's true anymore. I don't think it's any great secret. And I think thanks to Pope Francis, it was just part of his language, part of everything he did was Catholic social teaching. Thanks to Pope Leo, because of course, as soon as Leo chooses Leo as a name, everyone asks, why Leo? And of course, Leo the 13th and Rerum Novarum, the first Catholic social teaching. And I think thanks to Caritas Aotearoa New Zealand, because about 5 or 6 years ago, they put out posters and Facebook posts promoting the principles. And I'm sure you've seen all these little graphics and images. And with the posters, they've all got a nice little neat one-liner that goes with them. So I think it's no great secret anymore. And so I'm very conscious that most of you are probably quite familiar with the topic. And yet, even if we are familiar, I think it's always good to revisit and, just to think about it in new ways. I think too that Catholic social teaching, even for a lot of our Catholics that maybe couldn't name the principles, don't know anything about the teachings, it does become a little bit about, it's sort of part of the air that we breathe. And I think your average Catholic person, there's something about the principles and the teachings that just shape our everyday. I remember Pope Francis said that, growing up in the church in Argentina, that, the teachings of the Second Vatican Council were simply part of the air he breathed and everyone breathed. No one felt the need to go and read the documents. It was just the way that church was. And then he realized, well, actually, we also need to revisit the documents, because often while it's the air we breathe, we also breathe other air. And I think that's really true for Catholic social teaching, that, we do breathe the air of these principles, but in a worldly environment, sometimes the principles mean something different. So everyone talks about human dignity, but often meaning something quite different. And the principles of the common good, subsidiarity, solidarity, again, we can sometimes misrepresent them. So we can think of subsidiarity in terms of being autonomous. or we can think of the common good and confuse it with the greater good. So I'm hoping in this presentation to really just open up and explore particularly these 4 principles, because I'm aware that in 1 hour we can't do a huge amount. But I think just in a very quick way to place the principles in context. So the principles, of course, arise from the teachings. And when we talk about Catholic social teaching, we really mean modern Catholic social teaching, beginning with Pope Leo XIII and Rerum Novarum. Because, of course, Catholic social teaching's been around since the first disciples, the first apostles. But for us, modern Catholic social teaching, beginning with Rerum Novarum, 1891, 135 years today, this year. So, and just very quickly, because it's the foundational document, it sort of sets the scene. So, first of all, it addresses the state of workers, and particularly with the Industrial Revolution, there was a whole new sort of poverty. So a shift from, say, maybe subsistence living of peasants to now in a city, the impact of poverty. Secondly, the documents wanting to reject the socialist solution, because it wasn't just the Catholics that were concerned with what was going on. Lots of people were concerned. And, the ideology, the teaching of Marx and Engels proposed a solution to the problem. And the church and Pope Leo's wanting to reject that. And we can maybe pick up on some of those things. And then third, the document puts forward like this threefold solution. First, it says the church has got a role to play in social issues like poverty and human work, because the church can teach people, the church can guide people, etc. Secondly, workers, employers, employees, they've got a role to play. And one of the great things about Rerum Novarum is that it really drives home that, positive relationships are an essential dimension of, a just response to what was going on. And that's one of the sort of significant distinctions between that and like the socialist solution, because the socialist solution was, of course, to set the working class against the ruling class. So the church is saying, hey, actually, if you're a worker, do your best, do a good job. If you're an employer, treat your workers well, pay them properly, etc., etc. Obviously, it doesn't always happen. And then the third part is that the state also has a role to play. And particularly the state's role is in promoting the common good and making the common good a reality. So, first document, Rerum Novarum. And then we keep going. Now, I've colour-coded just to highlight, of course, the grey ones, they're all following on from Rerum Novarum. Quadragesimo Anno, 40 years later, Mater Magistra, 70 years later, Octogesimus 80, Laborum Exerciens 90, Centesimus Annus 100, and nothing since. So maybe Pope Leo might do Rerum Novarum Part 2. And I think it would be quite good if it was called Rerum Novarum Part 2, because Pope Leo, of course, was concerned about the new things. And Rerum Novarum, the first line of the document, these new things that are happening. And Leo very much concerned about that, which I'll come to. But one of the things, mentioning that Rerum Novarum is addressing the context of the day, all the documents are addressing what's going on at this moment, what's happening in history. So when John the 23rd with Parchment Terrace, there was, the fear of nuclear annihilation, just come the sort of the Cold War. So how do we have peace on earth? And then Paul VI with Popular and Progressio, the whole sense, what is it for societies to progress? What is integral human development about? And then 20 years after he wrote that, John Paul II followed up, and 22 years after that, 42 years, Benedict with Caritas in Veritate. And just a wee interesting aside, the reason that Caritas in Veritate is 2009 instead of 2007 is because it was all ready to go to publication in 2007 when the global economic sort of collapse occurred. So it was basically withdrawn and revisited and wrote to address that issue. Now, of course, some of you will know that that's not all the documents. Pope Francis also had Fratelli Tutti, which is regarded as one of the encyclicals. We also have Gaudium et Spes, the Constitution from Vatican II. We have the Synod on Bishops, Justice in the World, and then other documents that aren't encyclical, so that lower level documents. And then even like local documents. The New Zealand bishops used to have, I couldn't find it, on their website, basically a whole list of their Catholic social teaching. So, addressing matters like unemployment, like prisoners, like social welfare, those sorts of things. So there's that teaching at that level also. But just, I suppose, looking at Rerum Novarum, the first one I got there, Laudato Si, the second. And of course, Laudato Si follows exactly the same pattern, basically in terms of what's going on in the world. And, the first chapter just talks about, that we're destroying our common home. Then what can we offer as a church? And so what is the viewpoint, the understandings that we have that can help sort of bring a solution and help us forward? So very much the same thing, always the context and how we can respond to the context. Or to use that famous phrase from Gaudium et Spes, it's about reading the signs of the times. And I think that's where, while all of these documents are addressing the signs of the times, ultimately, like, we are learning to read the signs of the times as a people of faith. And who's to know what Leo the 13th would be? Maybe Delexi 2, is that the name of it? His first one on love for the poor could be counted. There's lots of the documents can be counted as sort of furthering social tradition. So, and this is where I think, Pope Leo maybe this year for 135 years might do an encyclical on human work, on Rerum Novarum, the new things, particularly AI and, the opportunities and challenges that, arise from that. So just very quickly, thinking of the teachings, which in a way bring forth the principles, but also the principles help to inform the teachings. So like the principles are often elaborated on or emerge within these documents in different ways, sometimes not named, but, alluded to. And then, of course, they don't come from nowhere. So understanding the source or sources, the source ultimately being Christ, as giving sort of as giving the sort of inspiration to the teachings, but also from where these key principles arise. And I think that's where, Catholic social teaching is often dealing with social, political realities, but it's not a philosophy. It's essentially a theology. It's our theology, our faith in God. It's our understanding of Christ. It's the inspiration from Scripture that actually gives us our inspiration. So that's the difference, say, with the socialists, the Marx and Engels are basing theirs on a way of thinking that leads to a solution. I won't go through all of those, but worth just highlighting like the scriptures. And like in the Old Testament, two key parts, like the care of the anawim, the little person, the poor person, the widow, the orphan, the stranger. And, Deuteronomy 24 is a good example. There's lots of random little guides and teachings in that chapter, but it constantly brings up, how do we make sure that those who are struggling in society are cared for and looked after? And, one of the examples is, if you've got grapes and you're picking the grapes from your vineyard, don't pick them all and don't come around for a second go. Leave the second go to someone else. Or if your olive tree, don't shake it the second time, Deuteronomy says. And it's interesting in Rerum Novarum, that idea of sharing wealth and sort of, I forget the phrase, but it's sort of, of what is left over to share with the poor. And of course, it was a teaching that got abused because it seemed to suggest, well, whatever I think's left over. And later documents start refining those sort of ideas. And then a really important one, just the concept of Jubilee. Anyone that's had an attempt at reading the Bible from start to finish usually falls flat when you get to Leviticus. It's not particularly interesting. But there's this great concept in there of the idea of Jubilee and the whole sense that in a Jubilee year, every 49th year, let's restore things to the way they were. So if someone's land's been taken or someone's been taken into slavery, let's restore that person. Let's restore that land to the people that originally owned it. And of course, Jubilee is something that we pick up on very much in our Catholic tradition. And it's essentially about how are we restored and renewed in this year of Jubilee. I remember in the year 2000, the Great Jubilee, there were lots of good ideas. One of them being that, the international debt should be wiped for poorer countries. Let's really take Jubilee seriously and wipe all debt. Didn't happen, of course. And then people said to the church, hey, as a church, how about, all those that are in, what are called irregular marriages? How about let's just call it a Jubilee year and everyone can be reset and renewed. And of course, that didn't happen either. But it's a wonderful concept and, of course, a challenging one. And then very quickly, like the New Testament, the ultimate theme's the reign of God. I like this quote from Jose Pagola, without hesitation from then on, basically, after Jesus returns from the desert, he devotes his time, his energy, his whole life to what he called the reign of God. And particularly Matthew, Mark, and Luke's Gospels, that's all that's talked about, the reign of God, the reign of God. What is it if God's sort of, the movement of God took root? Great commandment, obviously, love of God and neighbour. Pope Benedict, talked about, the three great parables, the Good Samaritan, the rich man and Lazarus, and the Last Judgment. And, the Good Samaritan featured a lot in Pope Francis's writings, of course. And ultimately, that ongoing revelation of God where Christ, inspires us and teaches us, challenges us. So just these being the sources. The others I'm not going to go into. Intellectual tradition like natural law and everything. The lived tradition, the fact that the church has always built hospitals, and actually that Pope Leo's document, De Lexi T, whatever, it has some wonderful reflections on, the different saints and religious orders that through the history of the church have responded to challenges and need, such as the Mercy sisters, Catherine McCauley and the sisters that followed in that, an example of the lived tradition that becomes the source of the teaching and the principles. And essentially everything's connected. So, it can't be just sort of the teachings are here and the principles are here. It's all intertwined. But anyway, and ultimately leads to some action. So you don't want me pausing for questions or anything? I won't.
I think we're all pondering and learning, Gerard.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, it's sort of like I feel a bit rushed, but if I can just now maybe sit with these four principles, because I'm sure that you guys have got policy documents that say this policy according to Catholic social teaching and honouring the common good, etc., etc. So I certainly see these policies, our school policies are always. So I just want to really start to explore, each of these principles just with a bit more depth. So human dignity, actually, there's only one principle essentially, human dignity, and every other principle is an expression of that. And we know that the way that we talk about the dignity of the human person is because the person is created in the image and likeness of God. And it's worth pausing. What does it mean to be created? So St. Thomas Aquinas said that, if we get creation wrong, we get everything wrong. But to see what does it mean for a human being to be created, I love this quote from Pope Benedict. This is at his installation as the Pope. We are not some casual and meaningless product of evolution. Each of us is the result of a thought of God. Each of us is willed. Each of us is loved. Each of us is necessary. And I think just such a beautiful sense of, hey, to be created gives us such incredible dignity. And also realizing that, our tradition has always understood creation as being our original creation, our ongoing creation. So right this very moment, God is at work creating you and me. God is breathing life into us. God is creating those trees, those plants out there, right this moment, that ongoing creation. And then out there will be ultimately the renewal of all creation at the end of time. So original, ongoing, and new creation at the end. So the sense of being created, and that's where in Laudato Si, Pope Francis, just highlights that provides a really powerful perspective for us to address the challenges of the natural world, because we are created, we are also natural beings. We are supernatural, but we are also natural beings sharing in the life of the planet. Our lives aren't disconnected. And secondly, if the word created is important, so's the word God. If we're in the image and likeness of God, if our understanding of God is flawed, then our understanding of the human person and the dignity of the person is going to be flawed. There was a wonderful book about 5 years ago by a Presbyterian woman in the United States. I'm not sure if some of you may have read it, called Jesus and John Wayne. And the wee byword was how white evangelicals, not just Protestant, but white Catholic evangelicals, corrupted a faith and fractured a nation. But, the premise for the book is this idea that, Jesus is aligned with this heroic John Wayne sort of figure instead of the vulnerable Christ that we know in the scriptures. And of course, our understanding of God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, a trinity of life and love, not a sort of self-contained being, remote and aloof, but this dynamic of life and love, a community, not sort of an individual in the sense of indivisible. So to have dignity is to be in relationship as the Father, Son, and Spirit are in relationship, in a relationship with love. So if we are disconnected, then something of our dignity is degraded or undermined. And it's interesting, often, when the word dignity is promoted, it's often promoted in a very individualistic sense. Part of my dignity is I won't need anyone wiping my bum when I'm in a rest home. I'm self-sufficient and I can look after myself. Instead of that dynamic God whose image we are created in. And then the common good, we probably talk a lot more about the greater good, which again, the greater good arises from a philosophy, and particularly the utilitarian philosophy. And utilitarian philosophy tends to almost have a mathematical approach to things. So it's about the maximization of good, but that doesn't mean everyone benefits. Whereas the common good is the good of each person and every person, that every person needs to be considered. And it's a wonderful counter to a spirit of individualism. It's affirms that we're a community, that if you're struggling and suffering, as St. Paul says, if the body of Christ is one part suffering, we're all suffering, because that shared existence that we have. And I think too, sometimes, what I detect in a lot of sort of meetings I go to is we sometimes confuse the common good with cooperation. So we justify the reason that we should cooperate together. All of us schools throughout New Zealand, a network, we should cooperate together because that is the common good. Well, no, cooperating is great, but then the common good as a principle of our teaching should say, what does cooperation look like? So cooperation is going to ensure that each body, each person is treated well and is protected in this. And this is where, like, I putting this together, I was very much thinking in terms of like governance. So for those of you like on, the boards, Mercy boards and other boards, it's like, governments, these principles keep, just challenging us in how we do things. And then there's like solidarity. And, solidarity was big in the writings of John Paul II, largely because of the context he came out of and of, in that Polish solidarity movement, that sense of standing together and being together. Excuse the noise. So whereas Pope Francis, in a way, softened it, Pope Francis used the word friendship a lot more, but, meaning the same thing, that we work together. And I think solidarity makes sure that our care for each other is not paternalistic, that we don't just do stuff for people, that, I think, for example, that during the cyclone and after the cyclone in Tonga a few years ago, a lot of the humanitarian agencies were there, and some of our Caritas people were there with, in a village, and one of the humanitarian trucks turned up, wound down the window and said, "Is this such and such a village?" Yep. Got on the back of the truck, unloaded the stuff and carried on. So there's no relationship, no friendship. So it's solidarity is we work together, we stand together. A few years ago in Dunedin, we set up a trust that we called the St. Francis of Assisi Trust. And originally we set it up as a way of offering interest-free loans. But as it emerged, it was just responding in creative ways to situations of poverty. But right at the beginning, one of the parishioners who was part of the group brought along an icon. It's a lovely icon of Jesus walking alongside the saint with his arm around his shoulder. And we always wanted that to be the ethos of our trust, that we actually walk alongside people, that we don't just do stuff for people, that in South Dunedin we get to know the people that are struggling and befriend them. Because what we discovered is that people that were going to get these crippling loans were almost always doing it because they were isolated and they couldn't see any other solution. So the washing machine breaks down, you can go to DTR and they'll give you one straight away. Whereas we worked out, actually, your washing machine breaks down, I bet you there's someone in the parish who's just bought a new one. And so we'd put it on Facebook, and the next thing we'd have a washing machine. Anyway, relationships. Finally, in terms of solidarity, one of the lovely examples we see in New Zealand is with urban vision. And I think it very much arose in the Anglican Church. I think Bishop, what's the Wellington Bishop's name? Yeah, I can't hear.
Justin.
Yes.
Justin.
Yeah, so I think Justin's been very heavily involved. But the idea of urban vision is all these Christian families choosing to live in the poorest suburbs of a city, send their children to the lower decile schools, and just living in those communities and befriending. Like, that's solidarity, as Pope Francis would see it, as friendship. And like, finally, subsidiarity. And as I mentioned at the beginning, sometimes we confuse subsidiarity with autonomy and being able to do our own thing. And in a way, it does protect that. It stops some higher power coming in and deciding this is how you are going to do things. But it's different than being an isolated, autonomous being. It's obviously aligned with, the other principles. But I think that real sense of upholding, one, the dignity of the individual, but also the dignity of each organisation, that if a family is able to, we shouldn't sort of step in and prevent a family from being a family, sort of making their decisions for them. And sometimes I think there's that, it's quite a delicate area when we are providing support and charity for families, that it doesn't in a way undermine their dignity by taking away their decisions for them. Anyway, just as mentioned, human dignity is expressed in all of those principles. So, a preferential option of the poor means that, of course, that those who are poor have equal dignity to every other person. But also, the dignity of those who are poor isn't just that we need to sort of make sure that they receive the basic sort of food and shelter, etc., which is part of it, but also that the poor and those who struggle, that they are empowered in such a way that they can contribute. There was a lovely story of like Mother Teresa going with one of her sisters to that heard about a family that didn't have anything to eat. They went in, took some food to this family, and as they were driving away, they noticed that the mother divided it in half and then walked down the street and took half it to her neighbour. And the sister said to Mother Teresa, that neighbour obviously needs food too. We've got more here. We should take some there as well. And Mother Teresa says, we can do that tomorrow, but we cannot deny that woman the dignity of being able to give. Anyway, just a couple sort of concluding sort of quotes. I like this from Pope Benedict. The church has to play her part through rational argument. So all the teachings are meant to make sense. So from Pope John the 23rd onwards, all of those encyclicals are addressed to women and men of goodwill, So sort of rational, but she has to reawaken spiritual energy, without which justice, which always demands sacrifice, cannot prevail and prosper. And so that sense of like our Catholic social teachings, a theology, but it's also a spirituality, a way of life that springs forth from our faith. So when I was talking about, it's like part of the air that we breathe, we often take for granted that our perspective on the world and how we make decisions and how we do things is so ingrained in Catholic social teaching and our faith. And you only have to meet someone or be in conversation with someone who has no connection to the church. And sometimes you think, wow, that those values are so different to what I have, And then just let Pope Francis have the last word. We must regain the conviction that we need each other, that we have a shared responsibility for others and the world, and that being good and decent are worth it. And yeah, that's... So sorry, that was very rushed, But if anyone wanted to ask questions, I can stop sharing. And do you usually have a kōrero or get out and enjoy the warm weather?
No, normally people can ask questions and make comments.
Hello, Eva. Hello, Hannah. And Gerald and Virginia. All these familiar faces.
Gerard, thanks for offering that. That's been fantastic. Really crystallised Catholic social teaching in a short space of time, and it's a powerful set of propositions. I know that one of the influences on the body of teaching, particularly the Latin American bishops, reflecting on the circumstances there, and of course Pope Francis was part of that conversation, no doubt, and the way in which the strands of liberation theology and the concept of the preferential option for the poor then created obviously tensions in terms of, well, what sort of political program might flow from this. So one of the challenges for the church, I think you alluded to, was how to sort of hold our space in this conversation without necessarily seeming to favour this political faction or that, or this agenda or that, and yet equally, eventually, some of the problems that we're wrestling with do require some sort of political engagement or proposition. I mean, we're talking about climate emissions and whether or not we're going to sustain or abandon targets, and we're talking about tax systems and whether the rich are sufficiently taxed, and et cetera, et cetera. So, in your sort of reflection on this, how, and particularly thinking about it from the perspective of mercy, and we're thinking about, well, what sort of voice might we have in the public square, and how do we sort of represent ourselves in a way that's got integrity, but also, a bit of cut through. How do you sort of balance out, on the one hand, this notion that we don't want to seem to favour a particular political persuasion or program, but recognising the reality that these things get played out in the world of politics?
Yep, definitely. I was trying to think of that. Cardinal Williams had a great quote about not being partisan, but being, I can't remember it, but certainly. So if you think of the methodology of, Joseph Cardine, see, judge, act, that the whole teaching body influences how we see things and how we make judgments and form, decisions. But if there's no action, then that's essential. There's a book just here by Clement Sedmak that came out a couple of years ago, but just the title, Enacting Catholic Social Tradition. So, we have to put it into action. And if you go back to, say, Rerum Novarum, in terms of like the political side, so there's that threefold solution. The church has got a task to play in this. And part of the church's task is to challenge the status quo and systems. It's to empower our people, so that people have, that do stand up and have good values and everything. So as a church, we've got a part to play. As individuals, in our context and our situation, our relationships are key. So we've all need to be empowered to take a part. And then the third part, and Rerum Novarum, the state has got a role to play. And so if the state isn't fulfilling that role, then we challenge it. And while the bishops would never say vote this party or that party, it does say, look, we need to challenge this. This isn't in accordance with the common good. This decision-making process undermines people's subsidiarity, because you've got the sort of national government, not the national party, but the government making decisions for a small community instead of allowing that community. So I think certainly that, we do have a political role to play in that we speak out, and stand up for things. And, like, Joseph Cardine, who, started the Catholic worker movement, the Catholic youth movement, his starting point when he was a young priest in Belgium, he noticed the kids leaving school when they were little children and going to work in the factories. And he noticed, first of all, they stopped coming to mass anymore, but he wasn't so worried about that. He noticed that they lost all their joy. So he'd watch these kids that had been at their schools coming out of factories and like basically heads bowed. And so the whole See Judge Act thing was he wanted to empower them to actually struggle and participate according to Rerum Novarum in society, so that they are uplifted and empowered. Yep, they're in a horrible situation, but empower them to speak out. So I think the church ultimately empowers us. Well, we are the church, but we are empowered as church to speak out and act. Time to go to the beach, is it?
I've got lots and lots of notes, Gerard. I think I need to distill them, and maybe I think maybe my brain needs a part two to then unpacking and having distilled it to then because you've talked about so many interesting concepts that we grapple with all the time. What does common good really mean? Because everybody, so many people challenge us and say, well, surely the common good means what's best for me, and not or yes, I'm all for the common good so long as it doesn't stop me getting my whatever it is. So these are things that we're constantly grappling with. And I guess for me, one of the interesting things in thinking this through is the church has such a role to play and does so much good, but where we do things poorly, very reasonably, we are judged appropriately on those poor things. And sometimes people say, therefore, you can't have a voice in that. And on the good side, because you've got this bad side, therefore, I'm going to negate that. So, how do, in this modern world where people tend to be quite binary, it's this or that, and I'm not going to consider all those grey areas in between, how do we have a voice, as part of a church that's flawed and all?
I think for you, Catherine, you've probably had to be more immersed than any of us in some
I think Virginia takes the cake over me.
Virginia, sorry. Virginia and you, you've been both immersed in that. But I think it's interesting, people still really respect. How many positive comments do you hear about Pope Leo at the moment? Now people don't say, oh, Pope Leo shouldn't be talking about, the American system and that, this and that. People say, oh, there is a leader that's speaking up, even though he's the leader of this very damaged, sort of broken organisation, So, and I suppose that's the, we cancel voices, and like part of being human is that, that we are created in the image and likeness of God, but we are being recreated too, because we are flawed, and we don't come from a position of superiority or but it's I think we've got to act and speak with as much integrity, and if there's not integrity, at a personal level. I think sometimes people know the sins of the church, but if they trust your integrity because they know you as a person, that has something to say. But it is, I think, like putting all of this in practice and recognizing, okay, as Mercy, ministries and all the different arms and that, there are tensions. And look, I sense them in sort of some of the work I do. Like, for example, parishes, say, with subsidiarity, should be able to, make decisions about themselves as a parish. But our Catholic ecclesiology is not the same as the New Life Church. So we're not autonomous, that actually we're part of the local church. For us here is Dunedin Diocese. So, my parish, I might want to protect my parish and not want to pay too much in way of levies. But that's not, part of the common good and solidarity, as we're all part of this. And then, of course, I change my thinking when I think of our diocese and working collaboratively or together with the other dioceses. And then I think, we shouldn't be giving out money to this and that, But and that's where there is a tension between, being, in solidarity, working for the common good, and honouring, the subsidy, honouring that, as parishes or dioceses, that we should be able to make decisions for ourselves that affect us, And if that gets taken away, then, yeah. Schools are the same, aren't they? Like when you explain to people paying attendance dues that, your attendance dues are helping to fund the building of new schools. And then I think, and they're all in Auckland at the moment, but it's like they forget that, well, actually, 20 years ago, someone in Auckland was paying attendance dues that helped us build this school, So, but I think we do still need to keep asking the question, and because it's not, the principles aren't sort of like, like you don't sort of push a button and the solidarity principle tells us what to do. The principles, that's where that enacting Catholic social tradition, he's got some great quotes in there, about the reflect, that they challenge us, they guide us, but they don't give us automatic answers, But I think having at least a decent understanding of what the principles actually means that when you're sitting around the board table and discussing this decision or that decision, you can have a good, robust conversation, knowing that you each, I know what this principle means, even if I'm not 100% sure how it applies to this situation. It's interesting, the etymology of the word apply, if we think of application, is similar to the word plier. So it's being pliant, like Anyway, sorry, Gerald.
Yeah, just a wee reflection on that. I think we've, and Astrid knows this probably, and Virginia better than the rest of us, but the predecessor to Whānau Mercy Ministries developed sort of a discernment tool called sort of M theory, and sort of M for mercy, I imagine, which is very much about, how do we keep in mind when we're making decisions in a governance setting or an executive setting, the most relevant principles, and hold them, I suppose, in some sort of dynamic tension. So, who are we listening to? Is there sufficient participation in this conversation? What are the interests at stake? How are they represented? Are we sustaining, dignity through this through this process, whatever it might be, and then in other settings, for example, the responsibility that Virginia and Bruce and Astrid have for our Tanaku Kote, which is a funding vehicle for the 5 Mercy colleges, very explicitly based on the proposition of common good. And, thinking about, well, what are the mechanisms that we need to put in place so that the common good, in a sense, can express itself? So the voice of the schools, the voice of the colleges, obviously, the discernment that Virginia and others provide to that, the advice that we might seek from others, obviously, information about the conditions of the schools, etc., and as well as, the economic circumstances of each college. So there's quite a lot to weigh. And, when we're trying to be active, in a sense, active, what's the word, proponents of this approach to decision making, we're also conscious that it's, as you say, it's not formulaic at all. It can be quite difficult to wrestle with, and even when you've wrestled with it, you're not certain necessarily that you've got the right decision at any given moment. I don't know,
And
Virginia,
I
you
think
might
that's
want
a great place to land.
Yeah,
It's a great place to land. We've grappled with this. We think this, we prayerfully think this is what is needed, and we might be wrong. But, it's like we had considered preferential option for the poor. So we haven't just said we've got 5 colleges, per head population, you get this. We do take into account other matters, and it is the grappling with it,
Okay. Are there any other questions? Thank you so much. I loved that. I listened, and also, like Catherine, made a lot of notes. So I really appreciate you giving up your time for us.
Well, that's good. Well, Natasha, I did notice a couple of days ago that the invite was for all day.
Yeah.
And I thought
I could have listened all day.
I'm sure it was 7 till 8. But I think, it wouldn't be very exciting on a Teams meeting. But, you could see that you could easily spend all day and still only scratch the surface, You could spend all day just reflecting on the scriptural themes, all day on one of the documents. So, yeah.
And can I just say, Gerald, your enthusiasm for that grappling. I mean, often we think of grappling as like more arduous, and it's an outcome we don't actually want. But what I'm hearing from you is actually the grappling. There's the beauty in the grappling, and that's to be encouraged. And just you're enthusiastic about that. So yeah, it's put it very much in a different light for me, which is great, very inspiring. Thank you.
Thanks, Virginia.
I will close us out with karakia. E te atua te whai, we give thanks for this time of learning, sharing and reflection, for the wisdom offered, the conversations shared and the insights gained. We're very grateful. As we return to our ministries, guide us to lead with integrity, act with justice and serve with compassion, and grapple with the things that matter. Strengthen our commitment to uphold the dignity of all people and to care for our communities and our common home. Inspired by the Mercy tradition, help us to recognise need with open hearts and to respond with courage and kindness. Bless each person here, the ministries we serve and those entrusted to our care. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.